The sound wasn't of an explosion at that moment. It was her voice. My mom, Clara. I was in the middle of the fire, the ground vibrating, the air heavy, my breath short, and yet I heard it, not as a distant memory, not as a dream. I heard it like someone hearing someone call your name in the middle of a crowd. Have you ever felt that? When a sound cuts through everything that should prevent it from reaching you? I tried blinking to push it away. It worked on the dust. It didn't work on the voice, it stayed. Soft, steady, so out of place that it hurt more than any noise around me. I thought I was losing control. I thought maybe my mind was trying to save me in some strange way. But the voice wasn't in a hurry. It wasn't panicked. It was just her, calling. My body continued doing what it had to do. Automatic, trained, empty, while inside something began to silently crack, like a wall that doesn't fall, but never becomes whole again. I tried to remember her face. Her smile came to mind. The kitchen came to mind. An ordinary afternoon came to mind. A life that didn't belong on that floor came to mind. Do you understand that feeling? When two realities collide and neither wants to leave? My mom, Clara. I didn't think about heroism. I didn't think about purpose. I thought about home. I thought about everything I hadn't finished being. I thought about how some voices don't ask permission to return. The sounds around me continued, but now they seemed distant, as if I were inside invisible water. Everything else was muffled, except her. Her voice came through clear, direct, almost too calm for that place, and I wondered, without knowing why, if anyone else would hear my voice if I disappeared there. Have you ever had a question like that? One that's not meant to be answered, but only to cause pain? I didn't cry. Not at that moment. The body doesn't allow that kind of weakness when it's trying to survive. But something shifted. Something that never went back to the same place. I realized then that war doesn't begin when the first shot is fired. It begins when something inside us decides to be silent in order to keep breathing. Her voice didn't say anything specific. There were no complete sentences, no advice. It was just presence. And perhaps that was what hurt the most. Because presence reminds us of everything that can be lost. My mom, Clara. I didn't know if it was a memory, or an invention, or mercy. I only knew that at that moment I wasn't alone, and that scared me as much as it kept me standing. Later, when everything calmed down, nobody asked if I had heard anything. They asked if I was okay. I nodded, not truthfully. Because how can one explain that a voice can traverse an entire field of pain without leaving visible marks? How can one explain that what hurt me most that day wasn't what happened outside, but what returned inside? Do you also carry voices like that appear when all seems lost? Sometimes I think that voice didn't save me from the war. I think it only warned me that the return would be harder than the journey there. Since then, on quiet nights when everything seems too calm, I still hope to hear it again. Not out of courage, not for comfort, but to remember that there is still something in me that hasn't been completely swallowed up by what I've lived through. And even now, as I try to understand what really happened in that instant, I still don't know if I listened to my mother that day to survive, or if I survived to continue listening, or if I survived to continue listening. Because after that day, the voice didn't disappear. It just changed location. It came to live in the silences, in the intervals between one thought and another, in that fraction of a second before falling asleep, when the mind is still too open to defend itself. Sometimes I wake up thinking I've heard it again, not with my ears, with something deeper, something I can't name. Do you also feel this way? When a memory no longer hurts like a wound but still weighs heavily as a presence? I tried to move on. I did everything people call getting back to life. I walked the streets. I sat at tables. I smiled in photos. I answered simple questions. I worked. I ate. I slept. I survived. But inside I was still in that second, in that exact instant when a voice pierced through the war to remind me that I was still someone's son. My mom, Clara. Her name sometimes escapes me without a sound, only inside, and I feel like I'm calling back something I no longer know where I left it. I haven't told this to almost anyone, because people usually listen to stories, but they don't know how to listen to silences. And what remains with me isn't a complete story. It's a space, an echo, an absence that speaks. I wonder if other people carry voices like that. If you do, if you too have ever heard someone when everything was falling apart. Even if it wasn't a real voice, even if it was just a feeling. If you feel like it, you can put it in a few words. You don't need to explain. Sometimes just a sign says it all. A period, a written silence, a me too. I'll understand. And if you want to continue walking through these memories with me, stick around. Not out of obligation. For company. Because some stories can only breathe when they're not alone. I'm still trying to learn to live with what doesn't appear in photos, with what doesn't fit into ready-made sentences, with what can't be resolved. Sometimes I close my eyes and try to remember exactly what her tone of voice was like. It was firm. It was soft. It was simple. It was everything at once. And I realize that perhaps what scares me most isn't having heard my mother that day. It's realizing that I still need to listen. Because there are parts of us that only remain alive as long as someone calls them. Even if it's only inside. Even if it's only in memory. Even if it's only now. And perhaps that's why I still talk about it. Not to explain, not to teach, but to prevent that voice from being completely lost in the noise of the world. If you're here with me, even in silence, that's enough. Because some wars don't ask for victory. They only ask for witnesses. And I'm still trying to figure out where I really belong in that story. No field, on the train, or in the space between the two. My body kept firing, but my mind had returned to the kitchen at home, to the smell of coffee, to a morning that no longer existed. The light streaming through the window was soft in my memory, too soft for that contrast. I remembered the sound of the spoon tapping on the cup. I remembered the wooden table. I remembered an old radio playing softly. Nothing heroic, nothing cinematic, just routine. And perhaps that was what hurt the most, realizing that the most real life was precisely the one I wasn't living at that moment. Have you ever noticed how memories choose small moments to permeate our lives? It wasn't a birthday. It wasn't a farewell. It was an ordinary morning, an unimportant morning. And yet, that's where my mind wandered when everything around me screamed. My finger was pulling the trigger. My heart was pounding on something else. Something nameless. Something that couldn't be contained in training. Something that didn't appear behind the scenes of any military decision. The hidden truth wasn't on the field. It was inside. I realized this too late. While the impact of the explosions shook the ground, the real impact happened in silence. Inside. Where no one saw. Where no one applauded. Where no one asked questions. In that kitchen, my mother didn't say anything. She just moved. She just existed. She simply was. And I understood then that my identity hadn't been built on uniforms, nor on orders, nor on speeches about courage. It had been built in that simple space, in that smell, on that morning. And all of this was being threatened by a gift that didn't ask if I was ready. Do you understand that feeling? When the memory seems more vivid than the present. I didn't want to go back to the camp, but I couldn't stay in the memory either. I was stuck in the middle. A strange place. A nameless place. Where the mind cries out for shelter and the body cannot obey. People talk a lot about transformation, but they almost never talk about how it begins. It doesn't begin with a decision. It begins with a fracture. It begins when something you thought was solid silently breaks apart. Mine started there, in the kitchen that no longer existed, in the coffee that I couldn't smell, on the morning that would not return. I wondered if that memory was trying to save me, or if it was just reminding me of what I was losing. Because remembering also hurts. Remembering creates comparison. Remembering exposes. I never told anyone this back then. There was no room for that sort of thing in the reports, nor in the eyes of others. There was an invisible agreement between us. Survive first. Feel later. But the later always comes, even when we try to postpone it. When I returned home months later, the kitchen was still there. The table, the radio, the window, everything seemed the same. And yet, nothing was. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds, just staring, as if I were in front of a photograph I no longer knew how to touch. The smell of coffee was in the air, but it wasn't the same. Or perhaps I wasn't. Have you ever entered a place that has always been yours, and felt you needed to ask permission to exist there? My mother spoke to me normally. She asked if I wanted to eat. She asked if I was tired. Simple questions. Questions that seemed unaware of the war that was still raging inside me. I answered. I smiled. I sat down. But inside I was still firing shots. I was still trying to understand at what point I had stopped being just a son and become someone who needed to learn how to come back. The silence between us was polite, affectionate, but heavy, because there were hidden truths there, truths that didn't know how to cross the table. I wanted to say that I heard her voice that day, but I didn't, because how can you explain that someone can be present without being there? How can you explain that a souvenir can be more real than touch? The decisions I had made had brought me to this point, and now I needed to decide how to continue living in a body that no longer fully recognized itself. Have you ever had that feeling of being at home and yet still feeling like a visitor? The transformation didn't happen all at once. It happened in small voids, in sleepless nights, in gazes that lingered too long on nothing, in questions that couldn't find a place to be born. My identity began to reorganize itself without asking my opinion. I was no longer just a soldier. I was no longer just a son. I was no longer just what others saw. I was a space in between all of that, a territory that no one had mapped. Behind the scenes of my own life, I tried to assemble versions of myself that wouldn't clash with each other, but there was always one that was left out. There was always a part that didn't fit. The memory of that morning kept coming back, sometimes while I was driving, sometimes while I was washing my hands, sometimes while someone was laughing near me. It was as if she were silently asking me, "Who are you becoming now?" And I had no answer. The impact of the war wasn't in the loud noises. It was in how everything became quieter afterward, how the colors lost contrast, how time felt strange. I realized that many people carry invisible battles. Some came from the fields, others came from homes, others came from choices that no one remembers anymore. Mine came from that voice, it came from that smell, it came from that morning. It came from the realization that I still needed to learn how to exist beyond mere survival. Silence became my most constant companion. A silence that wasn't empty. It was full of questions, full of memories, full of things that didn't yet know how to be put into words. Sometimes I sit alone and try to remember exactly the sound of the spoon, not the explosion, not the gunshot, the spoon, because that's where I still recognize myself. It is there that I still find something resembling truth. Perhaps that's why I'm talking about this now. Not to romanticize it, not to explain it, but to prevent this part of me from remaining hidden in the background of my own story. You also keep little moments like that nobody imagines are important. The transformation didn't bring me answers. It only brought me more awareness, more sensitivity, more care for that which is unseen. I still don't know who I am when I'm not remembering. I still don't know who I am when I'm not just surviving. I still don't know who I am when the kitchen isn't around. But I know that morning will stay with me, and perhaps that's enough for now, because some memories don't require understanding. They just ask for space, and I'm still trying to learn how to give that space without disappearing into it. If this part of the story touched you, leave a message, even if it's just written silence. I tried to ignore it, because remembering in that place was dangerous, but the voice wouldn't come out. It stayed, echoing like a footstep in an empty hallway, echoing as if asking myself if I was still able to hear without losing myself. I kept breathing the way I had learned, short, shallow, controlled, but memory doesn't obey technique. It just passes through. I kept telling myself it was just a reaction, that it didn't mean anything, that it was just my brain trying to protect something. But the hidden truth didn't need an explanation. It just needed to exist. The voice didn't ask for attention. It occupied it, and the more I tried to push it away, the more it settled into places I didn't know how to close. Behind my eyes, between my ribs, in the space where our name is still fragile. Have you ever tried to pretend you didn't hear something that completely affected you? My body kept functioning. I kept responding. I kept existing. But some part of my identity had remained frozen in that second, as if it had decided to wait. I thought about everything I had been trained to do. I thought about the decisions that had brought me to this point. I thought about the behind-the-scenes aspects of each choice I no longer remembered how I had made. I wondered if I would have done things differently if I had known I would hear that voice. But thinking doesn't change. It only expands. The transformation began there, not as courage, but as discomfort. As a presence that doesn't ask permission, as an impact that doesn't appear on the surface. The memory of that morning offered me no shelter. It offered me contrast. And contrast hurts. It hurts to realize that there's a version of you that still believes in simple things. It hurts to realize that there's a version of you that doesn't know how to survive where you are now. I tried to focus on what was around me, on what was concrete, on what could be touched, on what could be controlled. But the voice wasn't concrete, and yet it was more real than anything. I didn't know if it was longing, or guilt, or love, or just the last piece of something that hadn't yet been torn away. The hidden truth is that nobody comes back whole from anywhere. We come back functional. We come back recognizable. We come back acceptable. But whole? No. And I didn't want to admit it. I wanted to believe that simply leaving the field was enough to leave everything behind, as if the impact would remain trapped in the ground, as if memory had geographical limits, as if silence obeyed borders. But the voice did not obey. She came with me. She sat next to me on planes, on buses, in hotel rooms, in waiting rooms. She stayed with me when I didn't know who else to be with. Sometimes it came on strong. Sometimes it came as a shadow. Sometimes it came only as a feeling. But it never left. I began to understand that perhaps that voice wasn't about my mother. Perhaps it was about who I was before I learned to shut myself off. Perhaps it was about identity. Perhaps it was about remembering that I still existed for someone outside of all that. Have you ever felt that someone is calling you not to come back, but to not disappear? Behind the scenes of my life, I started hiding this part. I talked about everything, except this, because nobody knows what to do with this kind of story. It doesn't fit. It doesn't solve anything. It doesn't inspire in the right way. She just stays. Silence became the place where I kept it. A full silence. A heavy silence. A silence that didn't ask for an answer, only space. Sometimes I thought that if I told her it would lose its power. But telling also transforms. And I wasn't ready yet to transform that into something understandable. Because some memories don't want to be understood. They just want to remain memories. I realized that the war hadn't just changed my body. It had changed the way I remembered, the way I chose, the way I saw myself. Every decision after that carried an invisible weight. A weight that wasn't visible but was there. A weight that silently asked who I was trying to protect now. My mom, Clara. The name still echoed. Sometimes as shelter, sometimes as accusation, sometimes as longing, sometimes as nothing, but always as presence. The transformation didn't happen when I understood. It happened when I accepted that not understanding was also part of the process. I began to realize that impact isn't about the moment. Impact is what remains afterward. It's what changes without asking permission. It's what reorganizes the way we occupy the world. I no longer knew if the voice belonged to me or if I belonged to it. And maybe that didn't matter. What mattered was that, even trying to ignore it, I never managed to get rid of her. She didn't leave. She stayed, echoing. And in that echo, I began to realize that perhaps my story wasn't about what I've lived through, but about what still lives within me. Memory is no longer just the past. It's become a companion. Silence is no longer emptiness, it has become language. My identity is no longer a definition. It's become a process, and I'm still walking through this process, without knowing where it ends, without knowing if it ends, without knowing if it should end. Sometimes I wonder if that voice still speaks, or if it's me who's still listening. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still the same person I heard, or if I'm just what's left behind. But I'm not looking for answers to that anymore. I just let it exist, because some hidden truths don't need explaining. They are asking for respect. They are asking for silence. They ask for memory. And I'm still here, walking between what I was, what I am, and what I still don't know what to call. No rush, no conclusion, no map, only with that voice that never left, and with that echo that still stays with me. If this part also resonated with you, leave a message, even if it's just a piece of silence. In that second, I understood that the battlefield doesn't end when the war ends. It just changes location. He moves inward, to the small gestures, to the choices no one sees, to the behind the scenes of every daily decision, to the way we cross a street, to the way we hold a glass, to the silence that appears when someone asks something too simple. I walked through American streets I'd known since childhood, without recognizing them. The signs were in the same place. the shop windows, the lights. But something deep down told me I was experiencing a displaced version of the world, as if I were looking at everything through an invisible glass. Have you ever had that feeling of being present and absent at the same time? The impact didn't come in waves. It came in details. A car speeding by, a metallic sound, a distant scream that wasn't a scream, a radio playing at a low volume. Everything seemed to have a double meaning. Everything seemed to have a memory. I began to realize that the battlefield is set up where you least expect it, at the supermarket, in the bank queue, in the dark room, in the smile that doesn't fully arrive. It hides in ordinary places. It disguises itself as normality. The hidden truth is that no one teaches you how to come back. They teach you how to leave, how to resist, how to endure. But they don't teach you how to exist afterwards. They don't teach you how to relearn to interact with the world without fear of breaking it. I found myself making small decisions as if they were gigantic, choosing a path, choosing a time, choosing a word. Everything seemed to carry invisible consequences, as if each choice was being observed by an older version of myself. Behind the scenes of my own routine, I tried to negotiate with memories. I tried to say that now it was a different time, a different place, a different address. But memory doesn't move with us. It keeps the key. I realized that my identity was being silently redesigned, not by grand events, but by absences, by pauses, by questions that couldn't find a place to land. Sometimes I would sit on the sofa and stare at the television, which was turned off, not out of emptiness, but out of excess. Because there, in the dark reflection, I could see a version of myself that I hadn't yet learned to explain. You also talk to your own reflections. The transformation didn't happen when I decided. It happened when I accepted that I was no longer in the same place, even though I was at the same address. When I understood that the battlefield had changed scenery, but hadn't gone away. He now lived in the long nights, in the fragmented dreams, in the frights that made no sense, in the laughter that came too late. He lived in the way I held the phone before calling someone, in the way I took so long to reply to a message. I've come to understand that some wars don't end. They just learn to hide better. And I didn't want to romanticize it. I didn't want to turn it into a pretty story. I didn't want to portray it as an easy way to overcome adversity, because it wasn't easy, and it wasn't pretty. It was just real. The hidden truth is also that nobody knows exactly who they are when they return. We only know who we can no longer be. I could no longer be carefree. I could no longer be fully present in crowds. I could no longer listen to certain songs without feeling a strange weight on my chest. But I could no longer simply be what I had been. I was in the middle of it, between. A territory without a flag. A territory made of memory, silence, and trial and error. Sometimes I thought that if I moved to a different city, everything would change. But the battlefield changes along with it. It adapts. It settles in. It learns the new address. Have you ever tried to run away from something that walks with you? I started observing people, ordinary people, people who had never been to war, people who had never heard a voice amidst the chaos, and yet they carried their own battles, different, invisible, profound. That's when I realized that maybe the battlefield isn't a place, maybe it's a state of those who have had to defend themselves too much. My identity began to blend with this perception. I stopped seeing myself simply as someone who had returned. I started seeing myself as someone who was relearning to walk without constantly looking back, relearning to breathe without measuring, relearning to listen without preparing to lose. The memory remained there, not as an enemy, but as part of the territory, a part I needed to learn to cross without hurting myself again. Sometimes I would sit in silence and let everything come, not to suffer, but to acknowledge. Because denial also hurts. Denial also creates an impact. The battlefield now was the space between remembering and moving on, between accepting and resisting, between who I was and who I still don't know how to be. I realized that transformation doesn't erase. It reorganizes. It changes the place of things. It teaches new names to old pains. And I'm still learning these names. I'm still learning how to name certain parts of myself without trembling. I'm still learning how to navigate my inner self without getting lost. Silence has become my most honest language, a silence that doesn't apologize, a silence that doesn't explain, a silence that simply accompanies, and perhaps that's why I keep talking about it. Not to teach, not to heal, but to acknowledge that this battlefield exists, even when no one else sees it. It exists when I wake up. It exists when I sleep. It exists when I remember it. It exists when I try to forget. And it keeps changing addresses, keeping up with each new version of me. I still don't know how to live with this without turning everything into a defensive posture. But I'm trying to let memory be memory, trying to ensure that the impact isn't just pain, trying to let the hidden truth find space to breathe, trying to build an identity that doesn't have to choose between past and present, because perhaps that's what life is, walking through invisible fields, without a map, without guarantees, without explanation, and yet, keep walking, even when we don't know exactly where we are, even when we don't know exactly who we are, even when the battlefield remains here, silent, changing address, inside us. If this has touched your path too, write a word, just so I know I haven't walked this path alone. When I returned, no one saw the marks. They only saw that I was standing, but broken. People associate standing upright with being well, as if an erect spine were proof of integrity, as if the body could lie less than the face. I walked along the sidewalks of my neighborhood as I always had, the same corner, the same gas station, the same smell of hamburgers coming from a place that never changes. And yet, everything seemed permeated by an invisible layer. Have you ever noticed how the world keeps functioning even when something within you doesn't? Nobody asked about the nights. They asked about the weather, about the climate, about whether I was going back to school, about work. Clean questions, safe questions, questions that don't even come close to the real impact. I answered like someone who knows how to speak, but not like someone who knows how to explain. Behind the scenes of these conversations, my mind revisited scenes that had no audience, small snippets, incomplete sounds, sensations without captions. The memory didn't come in the form of a film. It came in the form of fragments, a detail, a smell, a pause that was too long before someone finished a sentence. My identity was beginning to silently reorganize itself, not as a choice, as a necessity. I needed to fit into places where I no longer recognized myself. Standing, but broken. I realized that being broken isn't about falling. It's about continuing. It's about functioning with parts out of place. It's about smiling with muscles that don't match the gesture. It's about walking with thoughts that are still sitting in another time. People told me I seemed strong, and I accepted it, because sometimes we need to adopt the version of ourselves that others see in order to keep breathing. The hidden truth is that nobody knows what to do with someone who comes back whole on the outside, but disorganized on the inside. There's no protocol for it. There are no ready-made phrases that really resonate. There are no simple decisions. I started avoiding mirrors, not because I didn't like what I saw, but because I saw too much. I saw someone trying to maintain a form that no longer matched the content. Silence became a kind of refuge, a place where I didn't need to pretend to continue, where I could simply exist without explanation. Sometimes I would sit in the dark room and let the memory wander on its own, not to suffer, to understand how it moved now, to realize in what part of me it still resided. I realized that invisible marks don't ask for care, they ask for recognition, and I still didn't know how to recognize mine without turning them into something I could control. The impact of the war wasn't a scene. It was a different way of perceiving time. Time became thicker, slower in some places, faster in others, as if it had learned to move erratically. I began to notice how lightly people spoke about the future. Plans, trips, dates, expectations. I listened to it all as one listens to a language one still understands but doesn't feel in the same way. My transformation wasn't a single event. It was a series of small concessions. I conceded that I didn't need to explain everything. I conceded that I didn't need to recognize myself every day. I conceded that some parts of me wouldn't return to their original place, and that hurt less than I imagined, because it hurt differently. I also realized that many people around me carried invisible scars, different battles, different decisions, different hidden truths, each with its own internal address. Perhaps that's why I started observing more, listening more, speaking less, because I knew there was something happening behind the scenes of each person that nobody was talking about. My identity began to become quieter, less defensive, less interested in being understood, more interested in not getting lost. Sometimes I felt like telling everything. Sometimes I felt like never telling anything. And I learned that these two desires could coexist without canceling each other out. Have you ever felt that way too? The urge to speak and to protect at the same time? I remained standing, going places, participating, existing. But inside I was still learning how to distribute the parts. I was no longer the same person I had been before. I wasn't yet what I would become. I was in process. And process doesn't like an audience. Silence became a space for construction, a place where I could dismantle and reassemble without haste, without witnesses, without expectations. I've come to accept that being broken doesn't mean being lost. Sometimes it just means being rearranged. Memory was no longer an enemy. Nor was it a comfort. It was an element, a component of my current structure, something I needed to carry without letting it completely define me. The hidden truth is that no one returns home the same way they left, not even when everything seems the same. The impact of returning isn't in the hugs, it's in the intervals, in the glances, in the silences that no one comments on. I learned that some decisions aren't made, they just happen, and then we spend our lives trying to understand when they began. My transformation is still in progress, not as a promise, but as a reality that cannot be explained in pretty phrases, but a reality built on small, internal tolerances. I'm still standing, but now I know that being able to stand is not the same as being whole, and perhaps it never will be again. But I also realize that being broken isn't the same as being finished. It's just about being different. It's just a matter of being in a different form. It's simply a matter of being at a different stage in one's own history. Silence still haunts me. The memory still lingers. My identity is still being adjusted. The decisions still weigh heavily. The behind-the-scenes events still exist. And I continue walking through all of this, without haste, without a map, without a conclusion, just accepting that some parts of me don't need to go back to being what they were to continue being mine. Standing, but learning to sustain what doesn't yet fit. If this also resonated with you, leave a word, just so I can feel that this silence also has an echo. People would ask if I was okay, and I would answer with my mouth, while my soul remained silent. I always said yes, always yes, a short yes, a yes that didn't invite questions, a yes that protected, a yes that wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. It was just a safe space between the two of them. You've already answered like that. Just so you don't have to open a door you don't know how to close. My mouth was learning to function in public. My soul was learning to hide in the background, not out of shame, out of economy, because explaining is exhausting, because translating what has no form hurts, because transforming silence into words requires an energy I didn't yet possess. I was walking through familiar corridors, offices, shops, cafes, places where life happens without asking who came back different. I held a cup of coffee as if it were part of an ancient ritual. The smell was still the same, but the impact now came from somewhere else. Memory continued to work in silence, like an archive that no one sees, but that organizes everything. Each sound had a second meaning. Each pause had a new weight. Each decision carried a story that was not yet written. I realized that my identity was becoming more observant, less reactive, less certain, more aware that hidden truth doesn't always need to be revealed to exist. Sometimes I wanted to scream that I wasn't okay. Sometimes I wanted no one to ask, and I discovered that these two desires could coexist without contradicting each other. The impact didn't come from the big questions. It came from the small ones. How are you? Did you sleep well? Are you going out today? Are you really okay? Simple questions. Questions that went straight to the place where I had learned to be silent. I would answer with my mouth. The soul remained still, and in that inner silence, something was reorganizing itself. A slow transformation, almost invisible. A transformation that didn't seek healing. It sought space. I began to understand that silence is also a form of language. A language that doesn't ask for agreement, doesn't ask for explanation, doesn't ask for an answer. It simply remains. You also keep things like that, things that only exist when nobody's looking. Behind the scenes of my routine, I talk to myself, not in complete words, in sensations, in questions that never ended, in memories that didn't know where to land. The memory of the kitchen, the memory of the voice, the memory of the countryside. Everything coexisted without completely mixing, as if each part had decided to respect the other. My identity began to accept that it didn't need to be singular, that it could be fragmented, that it could be temporary, that it could be silent. I realized that the transformation wasn't making me stronger. It was making me more attentive, more sensitive, more aware of the weight each person carries inside while talking about simple things. Sometimes I would see someone laughing and wonder what invisible wars were also being waged there. Sometimes I would find myself smiling and know that inside me there were still parts sitting on the ground. But that didn't diminish me. This made me more human. The impact of the war wasn't what I had lived through. It was what I had learned not to say. The hidden truth wasn't about suffering. It was about adaptation, about how we mold our own language to continue being accepted in places where pain isn't welcome. I didn't want to be the man with the heavy story. I just wanted to be someone who was still learning how to exist afterwards. And perhaps that's why I've chosen silence so many times. Not as an escape, as a form of self-care. Have you ever taken care of yourself like this by staying still? My mouth kept answering. My soul kept watching. And in that space between the two, I began to recognize a new form of identity. An identity that didn't need to explain everything. An identity that didn't need to justify its pauses. An identity that could be made of memory, of impact, of hidden truth, and still keep moving forward. I began to realize that silence was not absence. It was concentrated presence, a presence that does not spread, that does not offer itself, that simply accompanies, and I allowed myself to accompany that silence without trying to translate it all the time. Sometimes I would sit on a random bench and watch people go by. Couples, children, workers, lives in motion. And I felt that I was also in motion, even when I was standing still. The transformation wasn't external. It was an internal reorganization of invisible priorities. I started to respect my breaks. I began to respect my incomplete answers. I began to respect my aimless questions. Memory is no longer just a recollection. It has become a compass. Not a compass that points forward, but one that points inward. And perhaps this too is a way of walking. Decisions became slower, more thoughtful, less impulsive. I started listening more to what wasn't being said. I started trusting more in what I felt without a name. The hidden truth remained there. Not as a secret, as company. And I left. I let my soul remain silent without trying to pull it to the surface. Because some parts of us can only exist when we are not forced to explain ourselves. I continued answering with my mouth. But now I knew that the silence of the soul was not emptiness. It was careful. It was out of respect. It was time. And I'm still learning to listen to that silence without trying to correct it. I'm still learning how to walk with it without turning it into guilt. I'm still learning to accept that not everything about me needs to be said to be true. And perhaps that's what transforms me the most. Not what I'm telling you, but what I learned to sustain within. No audience, no translation needed, no conclusion. If this silence also seems familiar to you, leave a word, just so it doesn't continue alone. At night, the sound of gunshots returned, but along with it came her voice, as if she were trying to pull me out of the abyss. I would close my eyes and the room would transform. Not in terms of scenery, in terms of sensation. The ceiling seemed lower. The air felt heavier. The silence wasn't absence. It was an overwhelming presence. The presence of everything that hadn't ended. The impact didn't come from a complete memory. It came in fragments. A dry snap. An interval that was too long. A space between two sounds where my body decided if it was still here. And then the voice would come in. Not as a scream. As a line. A thin line cutting through the noise. Have you ever felt something like that? When a sound doesn't compete for space, it creates one. I didn't know if she was saying my name, or if I was the one who needed to hear it. I didn't know if it was memory or invention, but I knew that when the voice appeared, I breathed differently. A little deeper, a little slower, as if someone were holding my hand in a place where no one else could enter. The hidden truth is that I needed that voice more than I was willing to admit, because when the sound of gunfire returned, it didn't come alone. It brought decisions I didn't remember making, behind-the-scenes events I didn't have the courage to revisit, transformations that didn't yet know their proper name. The room was too dark for me to pretend. The memory was too clear for me to sleep. I turned to one side, then to the other, then back again, as if my body were trying to find a position where my identity didn't hurt. But identity is not a position. It's a process. And in that process, the voice was the only thing that didn't move. She came with a calmness that didn't match the rest. A calmness that didn't argue. A calmness that didn't demand. A calmness that simply stayed. Sometimes I thought that voice wasn't trying to save me. It was just trying to remind me that I could still be reached. You've needed this before. Not salvation, but connection. I began to realize that the night wasn't the problem. The problem was what the night allowed. It allowed memory to wander without asking permission. It allowed hidden truth to breathe. It allowed silence to speak. During the day, I could organize. I could choose my words. I could decide which parts of myself would be visible. At night, there was no backstage. Everything happened on the inner stage, and I would just stand there, watching myself. The impact wasn't the noise, it was the vulnerability, because when the sound of gunfire returned, I was no longer on the field. I was in my room, and that confused everything. It confused my body. It confused my memory. It confused my identity. But the voice kept something in order. She didn't speak in complete sentences. She didn't give advice. She didn't explain. She simply existed. And perhaps that's what pulled me most out of the abyss. Not the promise, the presence. Presence without negotiation. I began to understand that transformation doesn't happen when we understand. It happens when we accept what we don't yet understand. And at night, I would accept. I accepted that the sound of the gunshot still lingered within me. I accepted that the voice too. I accepted that the two shared space without canceling each other out. The silence between them was the territory where I tried to live. Sometimes I felt like getting up and walking around the house, just to prove that I could still touch ordinary things. The refrigerator, the wall, the door, simple objects. Objects without a history. Objects that knew nothing about me. But I also knew that the battlefield had already changed location, and now it occupied places that didn't appear on maps. He occupied his thoughts. He filled the pauses. He occupied dreams that didn't ask for permission, and the voice kept coming, as if to say without words that I was still here, that I still had a name, that I still had a place in some kind of memory that wasn't broken. Have you ever noticed how some voices don't speak? They sustain. I began to respect those nights, not as punishment, as a date, a difficult date, imperfect, but true. Behind the scenes of sleep, I conversed with parts of myself that I pretended not to know during the day, parts that didn't want answers. They wanted recognition. My identity was beginning to accept that it didn't need to choose between strength and fragility, that it could be made of both. Memory ceased to be the enemy and became matter, something I needed to learn to shape without trying to erase it. The impact ceased to be just pain and became a point of reference, a benchmark from which everything needed to be measured in a different way. The decision ceased to be merely practical and became emotional, even when I pretended otherwise, and the hidden truth remained there, not as a secret, but as a constant presence. At night, I no longer tried to fight it. I let it happen. I let the sound come. I let the voice come. I let the silence organize the space between the two. Sometimes I cried without knowing why. Sometimes I just breathed deeper. Sometimes I just stood there, staring at a point that didn't exist, and I realized that this too was living without performance, to live without speeches, to live without conclusion. I began to understand that the abyss isn't always a place to fall into. Sometimes it's a place to cross, and the voice didn't forcefully pull me out. It merely reminded me that there was another possible side, even though I still didn't know where it was, even though I wasn't ready to go yet. Silence remained my most honest language, a silence that didn't demand consistency, a silence that accepted contradictions, and I began to trust that silence more than any explanation. The memory still came back. The impact was still there. The decisions still weighed heavily. The backstage area still held things I didn't know how to open. The transformation was still underway. My identity was still under construction, and the voice still came at night, trying to pull me out of the abyss, without ever pushing me away from myself. Perhaps that's what keeps me here the most. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something still calls to me, even when I don't know where to go, even when I don't know how, even when I don't know who I am at that moment. And I keep listening. I'm still breathing, I'm still staying. I continue crossing. Not finished. Without defining. Without closing. If this night also lives within you, write a line, just so I know it's not only speaking to me. I didn't know if it was a memory, a hallucination, or mercy. I only knew it was the only thing that was still keeping me here. Not here as a place, here as an unannounced decision, here as an interval between giving up and continuing to breathe. I didn't have a name for it, and perhaps that's why it worked, because when something gets a name, it also gains weight, and I already carried enough. Sometimes I thought I was making it up. Sometimes I was sure I was remembering. Sometimes I felt it was something else, something that didn't fit into any of those words, and I left it like that, unlabeled, undefended, unexplained. Have you ever needed something that you couldn't quite define? The impact of that presence wasn't explosive. It was subtle, an internal shift, an invisible adjustment, as if my identity was being held up by a thread I couldn't see, but could feel. The hidden truth is that I didn't fully trust myself in that state. I distrusted my own senses, my own thoughts, my own certainties, but I trusted that voice, even without understanding where it came from. And perhaps that, too, is a form of faith. Not religious, human. Faith in something that requires no proof. I began to realize that my decisions were being influenced by this. I wasn't choosing paths based on what was most logical. I was choosing based on what wouldn't distance me from that feeling of still being here. The backstage of my routine was filled with these small choices. To stay a little longer, to breathe one more time, not to turn off the light yet, not to close the door yet, not to stop thinking yet. The transformation didn't come as a victory. It came as permanence. I didn't know if it was mercy, but I knew it was care. A care that didn't come from outside. A care that came from a place I hadn't yet learned to recognize as my own. The memory kept shifting within me, not like a film, like temperature, like texture, like weight, like weightlessness. I wasn't sure of anything, but I was sure of one thing. That's what kept me here, and that was enough. I realized that sometimes identity isn't built on what we understand, but on what we accept not understanding. I accepted not knowing. I agreed not to define it. I agreed not to translate. I simply agreed to continue. Silence ceased to be emptiness and became territory. A territory where I could stay without explaining myself, where I could exist without justifying my presence. The hidden truth wasn't about what I had lived through. It was about what I still chose to live through, even without clarity, even without a map, even without a promise. Have you ever felt like this? Sustained by something you can't explain? I began to realize that perhaps mercy isn't something that arrives. Perhaps it's something that remains when everything else tries to leave. And I stayed, not out of courage, by link, because of this nameless presence, because of that memory that wouldn't leave me alone. It was this silent impact that reminded me that there was still a possible place for me within myself. And I'm still here. Not entirely, not resolved, not defined, but here, being supported by something that doesn't require proof, for something that doesn't require a speech, for something that simply exists. And as long as that exists, I'll continue too, without knowing exactly why, without knowing exactly how, without knowing exactly who, but knowing that I still am. And perhaps that's all I can say for now. If this part also stayed with you, just write one word, so I know that this presence doesn't walk alone. Over time, I realized that the war didn't take everything from me. It left me with invisible scars, and a question that never leaves me. The question has no complete sentence. It doesn't ask for an answer. It just appears. In lines, at red lights, in bus windows, in cups of coffee cooling on the table. It appears like someone touching your shoulder without saying anything. Have you ever encountered a question like this? I tried to ignore it at first. I tried to call it a side effect. I tried to push it into the background of my routine, but the question doesn't accept background noise. It likes a silent stage. It likes when everything is quiet enough for memory to breathe. Memory doesn't come with clear images. It comes with sensations. It comes with weight. It comes with weightlessness. It comes with an impact that doesn't hurt the body. It just displaces identity. I began to understand that invisible scars don't ask for healing. They ask for coexistence. They don't scream, they remind. And remembering isn't about going back, it's about acknowledging. The hidden truth is that I no longer wanted to be the same, but I also didn't know how to be someone else. I was in a limbo made of decisions too small to be called change and too big to be ignored. I would change the subject whenever the question came up. I'd change the music. I'd change the street. I'd change my thoughts. But the question changed with me, as if it had learned my inner address. Have you ever tried to leave something behind and discovered that it could walk? Sometimes I felt the question wasn't about what I had experienced. It was about what I was still experiencing without realizing it, as if it were silently asking if I was truly present, or just functioning. The impact of this realization wasn't immediate. It came in layers that revealed themselves when I least expected them, in a casual conversation, in an old photograph, in a scent that shouldn't have had power, but it did. I realized that my identity was forming around this question, not as the center, as an orbit. I revolved around it, not to answer it, to continue existing with it. In the depths of my thoughts, I tried to translate that into something acceptable, something that could fit into short sentences, something that wouldn't frighten anyone. But the question refused to fit. It wanted to remain a question. The transformation began when I stopped fighting against it, when I accepted that not everything within me needed to be resolved. Some things just need to be acknowledged. Silence became the place where I let the question rest. A silence that didn't erase it. A silence that respected it. I began to realize that invisible scars are not a sign of weakness. They are a sign of permanence, of someone who has overcome something and continued walking, even without a map. Memory ceased to be merely the past. It became a kind of lens, a lens that altered how I viewed simple choices, how I viewed people, how I viewed myself. Decisions became more human, less certainty, more care, less haste, more listening. The hidden truth wasn't about heroism. It was about gentleness, about learning not to be violent inside. Sometimes I wondered if other people also carried questions like that, questions that don't want to be answered. They just want company. Do you also carry some? I began to treat this question as part of me, not as an enemy, not as a guide, as a presence. She didn't tell me what to do. She just reminded me that I was still in the process. And perhaps that's what transforms me the most. That's not the answer. Continuity. I still don't know what this question wants. I still don't know why she stayed. I still don't know if she'll ever leave. But I know she keeps me alert, keeps me human, keeps me moving even when everything seems still. The invisible scars remain. The question too. The impact too. The memory too. The silence too. The identity still under construction. And I keep moving forward with all of this, without over-organizing, without over-explaining, without closing it off, just walking, just breathing, only by allowing the question to remain a question, while I continue to be someone who is still learning to exist with it. If this question also lingers within you, write a word, just so I know it's not alone. If I listened to my mother that day, I would have survived, or if I survived, to continue listening. This doubt doesn't ask for an answer. It just approaches, sometimes gently, sometimes with impact, sometimes like a memory that doesn't know if it's a recollection or a warning. I let it stay, because when I try to push it away, it comes back heavier. When I let it stay, it just breathes. I learned that some hidden truths don't want to be revealed. They want to be respected. In the depths of my mind, this question speaks to everything I still don't know how to organize. It speaks to my decisions, to my silences, to the pieces of my identity that haven't yet found a comfortable name. I walk through the streets here and see people going to work, taking children to school, complaining about the traffic, laughing at small things. Everything seems simple, and it is, but it also isn't. Because I know that each person carries an invisible battlefield, some louder, others more polite, all real. The memory of that voice isn't a sound, it's a temperature, a presence that changes how I go through my days. Sometimes it weighs me down, sometimes it sustains me, sometimes it just watches with me. Her impact isn't in the volume, it's in the time, in the way she stays with me even when I'm not thinking about her. I realize that my transformation isn't about understanding what happened. It's about accepting that I've changed. that my identity isn't the same as before, that I don't need to fight against that to continue being me. I still make choices, small ones, almost invisible, choices that no one notices, choices that only exist inside, to stay one more minute, to breathe one more time, not to end a conversation, not to abandon a thought, not to close off a memory. Silence has become my most honest ally, a silence that doesn't explain, that doesn't justify, that doesn't correct, a silence that simply allows. Sometimes I wonder if that voice was mercy. Other times I think it was just love. And some days I can't separate the two. Maybe I don't need to. I realize that memory doesn't want to be healed. It wants to be integrated. It wants to find a place where it doesn't need to be defended or denied. A place where it can exist without causing harm. My identity is still under construction. Not as a project, but as a process. A process that accepts contradictions, pauses, and questions. The hidden truth is that I don't know exactly who I am without that voice. And maybe I never will. Maybe I just need to keep being someone who listens. Listen to the past without drowning. Listen to the present without hiding. Listen to yourself without abandoning yourself. The decisions keep coming. Small ones, daily ones, silent ones. And I keep choosing not to run away from myself, even when I don't know where I'm going. The transformation isn't visible, but it's constant. It happens when I accept that I don't need to solve everything to keep moving forward. Silence remains my safest language, a language that doesn't demand clarity, that doesn't demand conclusion, that doesn't demand promises, and I continue, with memory, with the impact, with the question, with the voice, with this feeling that to exist is not to answer. It's about staying open, open to what hurts, open to what sustains it, open to what I cannot yet name, and maybe that's what keeps me here. Not certain, but listen, that's not the answer. But the presence, not the conclusion, but the way. If this story touched you deeply, stay with me, and let your silence speak in the comments. If you felt something here, maybe it's because this story also touched a part of you. If you want, stay close by. Sign up not as a number, but as company. If any of these phrases resonated with you, leave a comment. No need to explain. Sometimes just being there is already a sense of belonging. And if at some point you want to come back, a like can be just a silent gesture of presence. I'm still thinking about all of this. And in the next video, maybe we'll continue this same silence from another angle, with another memory, with another breath. If you stay, I'll stay too.